And we're live. It is Sunday, April 4th, 2021. It is a glorious spring day in Washington. The cherry blossoms are just finishing on the bloom side in my neighborhood, so they're starting to shrivel up, but they haven't dropped off yet. It is a double blonde dog shirt day. We both we didn't send the memo to the mystery guest because
she looks like a reasonable, normal person.
Exactly.
That hasn't lost her mind in the pandemic.
Hold on. Get up. Come on.
Excellent.
I can't get him up.
Oh. We see the top of his head, though.
I see the top of the head. I see hi, puppy.
Go. I can't fake the shirt, guys.
You know,
but it's not a lab.
It's a noble effort.
I see a fuzzy little gray head. It looks very, very soft.
Okay, so I want to talk with you all briefly about the mystery guest poll today. First of all, everybody who voted for Olivia after she showed up is
a cheater
in the chat is cheating, and that doesn't count. That said, Olivia did decisively win on the merits, the poll of who the mystery guest is. 3 of you, despite my specifically telling you that the mystery guest was not Taylor Swift, voted for Taylor Swift. I assume that was Janine and 2 other people. I think there were 2 reasonable guests here. Sarah Longwell could have been the guest on the theory that I lied about the number of syllables. And Morgan Fairchild should someday be on In Lieu of Fun because she's very smart and interesting foreign policy thinker and is a very interesting person. And I have admired her Twitter presence for some time. Now, 4 of you voted for Tucker Carlson. Now, let's point out a few things about this vote. One, I told you
dislike Tucker as a female. Yeah.
I told you the mystery guest was female. I told you the mystery guest had 5 syllables in her name. And I was once asked by Tucker Carlson's producer to go on his show, and I responded with a polite note that said, I'm under contract to MSNBC, which at the time was true, so I'm not allowed to go on Fox News. My apologies. And also, I would rather eat my own foot. And so if you think I'm going to have Tucker Carlson on this show after sending his producers a note like that, I will say this. If Tucker Carlson adds a syllable to his name and becomes
a woman
and is embraces his transgender identity, he will be welcome on the show anytime. We are not allowed to have fun anymore, but we are allowed to have the great Olivia Troy, or as her Twitter bio calls her, Olivia of Troy, our mystery guest, the fan favorite in the poll, despite the packing of the poll after she had already won, which, we noticed, people. Olivia, welcome to In Lieu of Fun.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's my first time on the show. I feel very honored.
Well, it is the 373rd day in a row, except one, that we've done the show. And we should have had you on long before. So for those who don't know you, and there are probably a few in the audience who don't know who you are. I think most do, but a few probably don't. Let's just go through the history a little bit. And I think it'll jog some people's memories. You are the renegade former Pence COVID aide who quit and outed yourself before the election. How did you come to be working for Mike Pence, and how did you come to align yourself with the Sarah Longwells of the world in the in the weeks, months before the election?
So I was actually a career intel officer. So I have been doing national security for almost 2 decades, in and out of the community, but still focused on issues of counterterrorism, mostly focused on the Middle East, and then more of a domestic angle of it, looking at transnational organized crime. And so hence I end up at DHS. But I think what people
And you
don't
were
really
at
know.
DHS INA, the part of
Correct.
DHS that started filing intelligence reports on me. I want to say after you left.
Yes, I was not there for that. Although I
that
did
you
watch a
know
recording
of.
on it.
Yeah, it was a fun ride. I just
bet.
sued them.
Really?
Yeah, just
I
to
want to
get the
hear more about this.
documents.
Fair enough.
But that's a different. But yeah, so Olivia,
That's another session.
when she was done spying on me, how did you end up working for the vice president?
That would have been way more fun though, Ben.
Exactly, much more interesting than Mike Pence.
So I had been at DHS I was there. I actually started at the Department of Homeland Security a week before Trump got elected. So I actually didn't know what I was going to be working on until a couple months later when he was inaugurated, and the executive orders started launching one right after another, literally probably the day after he was inaugurated that day. And so I was there at DHS for 2 years. I knew Miles Taylor, which a lot of people know Miles. He was pretty outspoken. And I was asked, there was this kind of interesting scenario where they had asked if I was interested in working in the National Security Council. And when you're a national security professional, I mean, that's where you want to go, right? You want to do a term there. That's some part of the experience of being a national security professional, doing a rotation there. And originally, they'd asked me about going to the counterterrorism division and to possibly be the senior director there, which eventually becomes Chris Miller. And he took that role. And I had molded over, normally in a normal administration, that would be something that I would be gung-ho about and very excited about. But I had some reservations on that role. And so, months kind of go by, don't really kind of pursue that option. And then I'm asked, it's actually Miles who comes to me and calls me and says, hey, we need a really solid candidate for the Homeland Security Advisor to Vice President Pence. And we were wondering if you wanted to interview for the role. We think you have broader experience, the community really well. I had worked at the National Counterterrorism Center for several years. I had been at the Pentagon for several years, at the Department of Energy and the Intelligence Division. So I had a very broad network and kind of spectrum, I guess, to bring to the table. And so I said, okay, I'll interview for it. And I had been following Mike Pence tangentially. I will be honest. I know that there are a lot of people that have very, very angry views about Mike Pence and his politics. I hadn't been living in the political world. I hadn't been tracking Mike Pence and all his, I knew he was a Republican. I'd known him for a long time.
I was going to kind of ask you about this gently because I didn't want to push you on it, but I was like, he seems like he's like, but I was going to say that but then you kind of preempted me by saying that that you weren't living in the political world. And I just kind of want to foot stomp how that's actually very possible to be very engrossed in your job and not living in this.
I just want to really foot stomp this point because people think that people who are working in the government are
know
political.
Everything about,
You were at NCTC and and these are not political shops. And so I just pause a minute to describe the culture of the intelligence community vis-a-vis politics.
I don't think a
people
lot of
don't
people
understand
know that.
Yeah.
No, I started, okay, fair enough. I started at the Republican National Committee, fresh out of college. That is where I started, right? And I had interned there. And I had worked on Hispanic coalitions because I'm Mexican American. But then 9/11 happened and I went to the Pentagon. I was a Schedule C. I was a Bush appointee in the Pentagon. But I really wanted to work on policy and I really wanted to learn national security. And so I spent most of that part of my tenure and career learning from, colonels and generals in the Pentagon, right? I feel like I tell people that's where I grew up, basically, because I
Yep.
spent quite a few years there when when I was much younger. And then I joined the career service, and I worked mostly focused on counterterrorism and Al Qaeda because that was where our focus was at the time, and countering global terrorism. And when you're living in that world, I mean, that was where my focus was. I mean, you really live and breathe this. I had served in the front office at NCTC. I had worked on a lot of really major terrible events like the Fort Hood shooting, a
And
lot
this is
of
all during the Obama administration, right?
right. It's all in our, yeah. And so you really kind of serve, no matter who is in the Oval Office, you're really doing everything you can to work towards, as a team to stop these terrorists,
And
right? And you're
and
responding to events.
NCTC is, just for those who don't know, it's part of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. It's an analytics shop, not an operational shop. And its job is to provide all source intelligence analysis on terrorism. So there's
Correct.
nothing political about what it does. It's trying to give useful guidance, not policy political guidance, but analytic guidance of what's ISIS's capabilities right now that people can then decide what to do with in the government. Is that fair?
That is fair. And, I spent some time, the National Counterterrorism Center has a Directorate of Strategic Operational Planning. And at the time, I really was focused on, I was writing operational plans with the National Security Council at the time on countering Al Qaeda overseas. And so that is really where I was focused. I mean, I would come into the White House, I'd work closely with the staff there. But our focus was on countering what was happening globally, radicalization abroad in Europe, in Saudi Arabia. I mean, that is really where I lived, right? I was tracking these kinds of issues. And
so you're a career intelligence analyst and policy process facing bureaucrat who gets ends up at INA just before Trump is inaugurated.
Yep.
You have a political background insofar as some years earlier, before you went into the intelligence business during the Bush administration, right out of college, you were a political appointee and had worked at the RNC, but you don't have a particularly strong partisan identification. Is that right? I mean, you're
right. I mean, I was not, I've not been running political campaigns and participating really, because you really have to be very careful because there's the Hatch Act, right? And I was always super careful about things like that. Plus I had a security clearance. And so I was always very careful, you don't talk to the media, which is why this is a whole different world for me, right? It's just a different world that you operate in.
We're really scary. Someone's definitely going to clip you on be like, here, why are you hanging out with these people with these bizarre shirts?
Yeah, that's right. There's going to be a picture of you with the dog shirt crew.
The very partisan Labrador shirt.
Yeah. So did you have one of the things that both Miles and Elizabeth Newman have spoken about is how they got into this, what the components of the Republican identities were that caused them to go into the administration in the first place. You have a very different answer to this. You were already part of the career bureaucracy, but then you find yourself having this opportunity to go into a political role. Would you have described yourself, obviously not publicly, but to friends and whatever, as a Trump supporter? What were your feelings about the administration, as a career bureaucrat with a Republican background?
I mean, there's no hiding. I was known for being more Republican leaning in my circles of friends. They knew that that's where I started. They knew that that's how I was raised. look, truth be told, I was not a Trump fan. He lost me when he called immigrants rapists and criminals and thugs because, my
That was day
uncles
one.
yeah, those were my uncles were migrant farm workers. So
I was going to say it wasn't day one, Ben. It was like sadly like that was like I mean it was like in the whole scheme of things, but it was during his campaign, but it was not
It was right
like,
at the beginning of the campaign, yeah.
Yeah, it was. And I thought, to me, I think there was a part of me that thought maybe that was all campaign rhetoric. And he just, because that's who the Donald Trump show is. And maybe now, I will say that when the election happened, probably for 24 hours, I thought maybe he'll check that at the door. And now that he's gotten the vote and he's in office, once he gets in the role and realize the seriousness of what it means to have the weight of the world on your shoulders being the president of the United States, maybe he'll be different, right? And maybe he'll be more serious and carry out the role. Obviously, the day after inauguration, and all the chaos hits, that all kind of flies out the window because he's true to himself. That's who Donald Trump is, right?
So now it's 2 years later, and you're asked nothing about the first 2 years are especially reassuring. And you've been at INA during the whole, the whole fiasco about the travel ban. And now Miles wants you to interview for the vice president's national security advisor. Obviously, it's a great position, but you got to have pretty mixed feelings about it at that point, given the water under the bridge and your feelings going in.
Yeah, so I had some reservations about what it would be like to be going into that type of environment. But I did meet with some of the people on the national security team. And for the most part, that team is career people. It's foreign service officers. It's career diplomats, it's career intelligence officers, and it's career military officers that serve on the team. And so when I met with them, I had no reservations really about the people that were working there. I will say this, at the beginning, I was interviewed by someone that I really liked. And it was a female, and she was very strong and it's intelligent. And so I ended up getting the job offered to me, but she ends up getting removed from the role literally a week before I'm supposed to start. And so I kind of am like, okay, wait a second. I just agreed that I would come and work for this national security advisor at the Homeland for Mike Pence. And I thought that this person would kind of be the person I would be working with at the helm. But then it's General Kellogg, who's actually the national security advisor. And I will say I was actually deployed with General Kellogg to Baghdad. And so I had been in Iraq with him back in 2003. And so I knew General Kellogg, but I knew him from a very different role, right? I didn't know him as what he really became, which was a Trump loyalist, which I didn't really actually know about him. I mean, I kind of knew
very much
him,
like the people who served with Mike Flynn in Iraq. I have a good friend who served with him and describes him as the greatest intelligence officer he ever worked with, and has no vocabulary to describe what happened to Mike Flynn in Washington. And different situations bring out different sides of people.
For sure. And so, I met with General Kellogg. He recognized me, and so he asked me flat out. He said, "Why do you want this role? Like, why do you want to work here?" And he was very blunt about it. And I said, because I really want to make a difference, and I feel like I can do the role well, and I can serve well, and I know that I can do the job. And I didn't know how General Kellogg was going to react. I answered his questions very bluntly. He asked me personally, he's like, "How do you feel about Trump?" And I was like, some of his rhetoric really bothers me. That's how I answered that question. And he said, "Well, will that get in the way of you doing your role very well for Mike Pence?" And I said, Well, no, because I'm a career national security advisor at professional, right? And my job is to serve as an advisor and check the politics at the door. I wasn't there in a political advisory kind of position, right? I was there solely to deal with homeland security events, and I was the emerging threats person. So I was there for the natural disasters whenever FEMA deployed or anything like that. And I dealt with the mass shootings, and I dealt with any like global immediate threats, like bombings, global bombings, like the Easter bombing that happened in Sri Lanka, which was awful. Like things like that fell under my portfolio. And so I go into this world knowing that it's not going to be easy, and knowing that the Stephen Millers of the world exist. And I had already, I'd already seen the Stephen Millers of the world because they had a lot of say at DHS, and they were very involved in the things that we were working on. But I certainly, I will say this, I don't know that I ever expected it to be so political, especially because I had the Homeland portfolio. And it was a challenging situation, more so probably for me than others on the team. Because when you have the Homeland Security portfolio, it's really a big intersect with domestic politics.
Particularly when domestic politics boils down to build the wall, right? Like the whole orientation of the administration to domestic politics centered on immigration.
Right. And then, you're watching the child separation happen, and you're watching these kinds of discussions happen. and that is very hard. I will say that was very hard for me to sit there as a career advisor. Now it's very different because you're not driving the policy like you would normally on a National Security Council position. Does that make sense? It's more, you're solely there to really keep the vice president informed and weigh in when he wants to weigh in on something, if that makes sense. So, but I was there in the meeting where they talked about the child separation and then the children, and not being able to find the parents. And I'll never forget that day, because I remember going back into my office, shutting the door and putting my head down on the desk and being like, I can't believe I just heard that. I can't believe this is happening. And my colleague, I remember, knocked on the door, and I had just started sort of in the role not long before, and he covered Latin America. And he came in, and I remember he really had to really sort of talk me down from the ledge, I would say, because he was like, what happened? And I told him what happened in the meeting, and he was like, yeah, well, you and I are going to work closely together because you have the Homeland stuff, but it's not going to be easy. And you're going to find yourself having a lot of difficult conversations with the VP. And I think that was a very eye-opening day for me. And, but I did, I will say, well, Ben, you'll appreciate this, like the known and suspected terrorist definition.
Right.
That was something that I had to really explain over and over repeatedly, and get people to stop repeating that phrase and calling it that for people coming to the border, because it was just simply not accurate. It was wrong, and it was actually incorrect. And I had a conversation with Russ Travers about this, who called me, and that's the hard part when you're in the situations, when you have people that have mentored you throughout your career, senior people who have served at the highest echelons of the intelligence community, who call you and say, I thought I taught you better than this. And those are the conversations that really hurt.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm curious because, and you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, but I'm just curious, like, I just had a lot of friends who went to various parts of DOJ or or the White House at various points during the Trump administration. And if nothing else, they were also very concerned about their future employment. Like, they were aware that going and working for Trump was this polarizing, maybe it's slightly different for the vice president, but that it was going to be a polarizing experience. And so was that something that you kind of were thinking about at all, or that kind of hit you, or is that kind of just you were kind of focused on the job and you were just in duty and kind of not thinking about that?
No, that's a fair question. I think I felt it was slightly different working on the VP staff, but you still are working in the Trump White House, right? So overall, he is the person that is in the Oval Office. And I think it was fair that I did sort of weigh, how does this impact me and my career? What are people going to think if I do this? I had hoped that people who knew my character and knew me in intelligence community circles would know me and my capabilities and would know that was not going to change me. Does that make sense for the longer
No,
term?
it makes total sense. I actually think it's
but
like,
you really have to think of it that way.
yeah.
But it doesn't mean that there weren't days where I walked out. And I will say that I spent a lot of nights walking out late night. And probably the one thing that kept me going is I would stare at the White House at night walking out of either the West Wing or the Eisenhower building. And I would remember that it was the people's house and that I was there to serve the American people. And it may sound corny or cheesy and ridiculous, but I literally would take a deep breath, stare at the house, and gain strength from that and be like, okay, it's 11 o'clock at night, you're exhausted and you might be angry at whatever happened that day. But at the end of the day, like, not many people get to walk these gates, and you have to do this job well, and you've got to hang in there, if that makes sense. And so
that makes
that
complete
kind of
sense.
is what
And
got me through
yep.
it.
Yeah. No, I think that's nice. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
And yet, a few months later, COVID sort of sent you over the edge and you left. And so my question is, what was different about the COVID response from the things you had been seeing, where you would leave and look at the house and say, I gotta, there's a service call that, that's larger than than the anger that I'm feeling right now, where you say, okay, now it's time to quit and make a video for Sarah?
I will say that my last year, I would say during the impeachment proceedings, I can't tell you how hard it was for a lot of career intel officers to watch what was happening to our colleagues that we had worked with.
Right.
And watching Alex Vindman, watching my colleague Jennifer, who I was very close to on the VP staff, testify. And it was hard because of the way we
This
got
is Jennifer
treated.
Williams.
Right, Jennifer
Yeah.
Williams. And it was hard because we hated the way the things that people were saying about them, but it also impacted people like me and others working in career roles because they really started to treat us differently. And we really got treated like the deep state. Like, no matter what you did, your expertise, no matter how many years you had worked in whatever field you had been, and you're an expert, there was a culture there that started to shift. Now, this is happening in early last year, sort of, late year 2019, but definitely in 2020. And so in January, I am thinking they're going to focus more on the campaign. I'm going to think about what I'm going to do next, right? I've served in this role. I've worked on numerous mass shootings, and it's been very hard. Have I made a difference? I mean, you could argue yes or maybe no, but I can tell you that there were times where I did win some battles in terms of how the vice president spoke publicly on things and things like that I think really mattered. There was definitely battles that I lost as well, right? That I was not going to win no matter what. But when it came to the pandemic, I had been working on it since January, prior to the vice president leading the task force. And so I was sitting in every single task force meeting that happened from very early on. And I watched a concerted effort by people like Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx, and people who, Dr. Birx comes into the picture later, but who were very concerned about what was happening, and who were actively trying to figure out what we were going to do and what was happening in China because we didn't have access into the ground. And so at the beginning, I would say that we are in crisis mode. And my role quickly shifts in January because I think it's going to be all campaign and everything, which eventually it is. But I realize that I am in the middle of managing a crisis, and this one is going to be major because this is going to be a pandemic like we've never faced. And so I realized I have to double down. And even though I've been there, 2 years or so, I decided I can't leave now because leaving now is in the middle of the worst disaster we've had, and I don't know what's going to happen. Now, I'll say the calculus of thinking about that when you're thinking about leaving is when you start looking around you and the good people that you're working with that are national security professionals leave, and either they don't get backfilled because they don't want them there and they start to shrink the NSC, or they start to backfill them with loyalists who are detrimental in major ways that I saw, that does give you pause, because you start to think about who is going to come after me, like who will replace me, and how will they do the role. And I'll say that's fair. I mean, it really weighed on me, that guilt, because you kind of feel like you want to hang in there, like, because you don't know if a loyalist, sort of speak, is going to come after you, and whether they'll make a difference or not. And it's very hard to weigh that every single day when you're working there and wondering what's going to happen.
Quick
and also
question.
has to be sorry, go ahead, Ben.
Quick question about this. When at the very beginning of the Trump administration, I started getting letters from people in various different capacities about whether they should continue to serve. And I tried to publish all of these letters always with the permission of the individual and respond to them in public on Lawfare. And my basic position was, if you're in a career position and you can stand it, you should stay. And if you're in a political position is very different. It very much depends on the specific political position and what you're trying to do. But the argument for the General Mattis is much better than the argument for the person who thinks they're essential to run. I don't know how you can ethically run the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, for example, for a guy who says he wants to ban Muslims from the United States. Like, I just think there's a genuine problem there. Did you think of yourself as a career official, or did you think of yourself as a political official at this point? Because you're in a political role, but you're in it as a career person, which is a issue that I didn't confront in thinking about that. And I'm trying to decide, like, which one you were. On the one hand, you're in the office of the vice president, which is the quintessential political position. On the other hand, you're there detailed as a career intelligence officer. So how did you think of yourself?
So primarily as a career intelligence officer, because I wasn't there to really make the political decisions. I wasn't there to kind of push the political narrative. So if he asked me a question, I answered based on facts, right? I would answer with the intelligence, or I would answer with the information that I had at hand. Like, whether it was a mass shooting, I would give the facts and stats on what's happening here. This is what we know. This is what the person's posted on social media. I would flatly say, yes, this is a person who is a white supremacist. He's posted these manifestos, right? Like, we had conversations like this, especially after the El Paso shooting, for example, which happened to be my hometown. And so I didn't quite weigh in. My job wasn't to say, well, and politically, I think that you need to say this because your evangelical base or the NRA or things like that. That was somebody else's job, if that makes sense. The issue, though, is I think you have to be politically savvy, though, to survive. Because otherwise, you will not be included in meetings where you will be able to make a difference. And that's where it's a careful calculus of having to be able, like, learning to navigate the political landscape. And so you have to know sort of when to just listen around you, but you really have to actually, I think, on a daily basis, remind yourself that you're really the career person. And I will say this, trust me, they let you know it. There was not a day that didn't go by when Mark Short didn't remind me where my place was sometimes.
Yeah.
And I will say that I probably become more political during the pandemic response, because then I feel like this is a very dangerous situation. I strongly in my heart was like, lives are at risk. People are going to die. And this is a very, very, like, this is a major emergency, right? And it was very clear to me that a lot of the people on the political side were in over their heads, and they had never dealt with something of this magnitude. And I hate to say it that way, but when you're in a situation like this and you have people who have never served in government or have never been around this apparatus and how it works and how it all comes together, in a moment like this, that really matters. And I think that that was part of the detrimental response that happened here, as there were silos and shadow task forces created, and there was a construct that was created outside of the National Security Council's policymaking apparatus, right? And so the system completely breaks down. And so to get back to your other question, I think I'm sitting in these meetings and we're factually discussing the data, the science. I'm watching Dr. Fauci, I'm watching the, there was a major discussion on masks and the fact that we didn't have enough PPE and that we needed hospital workers to be able to access it. That was a real conversation that happened. There was concern about that. There was confusion on the messaging and what time, what's going to happen. So all of these things are happening. But I think for me, it becomes a situation when I realize that they want to get back to normal so badly so they can go back to having these rallies and getting that messaging across, and they start to really push to open up the country, and they start bullying the governors. And I'm in those conversations and calls where, Trump is hammering them, and then the protests start up and he's hammering them for being weak. And then the Liberate Michigan starts up. All of this is just fundamentally so dangerous during a pandemic situation where this is just going to create greater division and destroy the response, right? And when you have this group of people that we've been working 16 to 20-hour days, there were times when I was on the phone with CDC until 2:00 in the morning, literally for hours, talking to the career scientists there, where we were strategizing on how we were going to have a meeting the next day and how they were going to present something. And I was trying to advise them politically on what I was hearing inside the house. And that's some pretty inside baseball for you guys, but I can't tell you what it's like to expend energy on that when you have other
so
things
much
that you
energy.
could be doing.
So this is the harbinger of this whole situation, is the story that Jim Comey tells about briefing the president-elect. He's not on, I believe, January 6th, 5th, 2017, right? So he's go to Trump Tower and they brief him on the 2016 election interference. And then the response is entirely about how to spin it politically. There's no response about what do we do about the fact that Russia's doing this, right? The only response is about how to handle, how to make it look less bad from a political point of view. And Comey has talked about how basically unpatriotic he found that response. And that's the urtext of all of these things, right? Where, you're the White House official, IEU, is on the phone with the CDC trying to give them information about how to make a presentation the next day at a meeting at frickin' 2:00 in the morning that the political folks might be receptive to, but it's the same fundamental thing, right? They have their political objectives and they actually just, I hate to say it this way, it's not that they don't care if 500,000 people die. It's that they don't care enough if 500,000 people die to do it differently and to sort of act like preventing that is the exigent circumstance against which you have to give up all other objectives.
Yeah, and towards I guess this summer when we're having meetings about schools and children and what to do about the schools, right? And Trump is tweeting about the CDC and how he's angry about their school policy and guidance while we're in a meeting discussing it, right? And I have Dr. Redfield holding up his cell phone, walking up to me saying, "Did you know about this? What is this?" I thought he was fine with it. And I'm sitting there kind of in shock like they are, right? And I don't know how you're ever going to win in a situation like this when that's constantly happening to you. And I think that's finally, I get to the point where I think that you have to ask yourself, am I still making a difference? And I will say that when the remarks for the vice president that I would fact check, language that I'd written, when that language would start to change behind the scenes without me knowing it, and I would walk in and Mike Pence would basically chew me out for whatever it said, and I would have no idea what was on the paper in front of him, thinking that something else had been written that was factual and stats and things that I put in there, but it's not what's there. That was where I just start to kind of to say, like, look, this scenario is so out of control that no amount of hanging in there, fighting, calling the CDC, working together is really going to impact this, right? And so I get to the point where that is where it's like, okay, this is enough. I can't continue to be a part of this. Like, this is going to hurt people. It's going to continue to hurt people. And I'm not going to be able, you just can't, you're not going to win in this situation, right? That's not where the focus is. And also, I mean, just morally, I just couldn't live with that anymore. I was just like, I can't be part of this anymore. And so I leave. And it's hard though, because I will say this, not only do I leave, like, it's not like my job was ending on January 20th if he didn't win re-election, right? Like, I was a career person. I could have
You'd
gone
go
back
back.
to DHS.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
there's so many people
talked to the HR
that
people.
like the wimp left, or like, I don't know how to put it, but like just kind of like coward left. I feel like in the two, like after between January 6th, I mean, we've talked about it obviously, but the huge onslaught of people that like foot stomp left, or like wrote an angry letter and then left a job that they was going to be over in 2 weeks anyway, and they already had another going to go into it. So I mean, I think there's something really serious about the difference there.
Yeah, I mean, it was. I make the decision, and not only do I make the decision to leave the White House, to be honest, I make the decision to leave my career, basically, because I realize that you can't leave this circle and not be tied to this circle, if that makes sense, especially back at DHS, because they have such reach into that department. And so I just decide that it's better for me to walk away from the entire thing, because that's the only way I'm going to be able to separate myself completely and just kind of assess what has happened. And I spent a lot of time, I will say, I mean, it was a good couple of weeks really trying to process what had happened.
So what are you doing now? You know, you went through this period where you were very visible. You you've done work with Elizabeth and Sarah on the Republican Accountability Project, but like at the end of the day, you're a former intelligence officer. You're not a political operative. So what happens to you now?
Well, you know, I lucked into, I will say, Sarah Longwell. And
Yeah, a lot of people luck into Sarah Longwell. It's one of her skills.
I got, I was very fortunate that I really am grateful that I lucked into Sarah Longwell and Bill Kristol, to be honest, who got me through the initial moment of speaking out. I cut the ad with Republican voters against Trump, and that was very hard for me. I was scared, right? I didn't know what was going to happen, and I didn't know that I would ever work again. I mean, I don't know. I still don't know if I'm ever going to actually really work again, so to speak, right? I don't know what the future holds. And so, but I will say that after having gone through this whole experience, I think what I learned about myself is I think that I am, after everything that I've seen that's happened, I think that I am more on I never want this to happen again. And I just don't, I will do everything to continue stomping out Trumpism, if that makes sense. And
Yeah.
so and that is why I'm involved in Republican Accountability Project, because what happened on January 6th was awful. And there were some significant leaders of the charge in that who are Trump's right-hand people. And I don't want them to be in office. And I want to support people that are either going to run against them and get these people out, because I think that they are fundamentally, not just politically, right? I don't even know, I call myself a recovering Republican now, but because I don't know what else to call it after all of this, but I think it's dangerous for the country. And so I think I've been sort of, and it is hard. I will say I have not been a political operative. I don't operate in political campaigns, and I have found myself in a very political situation, I guess, but I've seen enough firsthand and lived it to see what these individuals are like and what their character is like.
I think you made, though, I think I just want you to be a little bit easy on yourself and kind of also kind of, and I know that you're worried about kind of and not worried, I think that like you rightfully are like concerned about like the impact. You feel like you left your career and everything. But you sharing this story is super important because this is not the first or the last time that somebody is going to have the hard question of like working inside an organization or inside a political party or inside an administration and trying to change it for the better, right? And thinking they can make a difference, or working outside it and kind of railing from the outside and trying to do it that way, right? And you made one particular type of bet and you did as much as you could and you withstood as much as you could until you couldn't anymore. And there's a lot of courage in that. And there's like, I think that there is also just like, people make individual choices and you have no idea how like those are going to basically butterfly into like other types of things. And you telling this story, I think, is a really important part of kind of like making sure that like, I don't know, that this doesn't happen again and people have an understanding of that, it's humans all the way down inside these organizations and how these things run. So thank you so much for talking about it openly. I think it's far more rare. Not just like, I'm not just even talking about like getting rid of Trump and stomping out Trumpism, but it's just like, it's a really great story of like how difficult these choices are.
Richard Wattenbarger.
Hello.
The floor is yours.
Thanks. Olivia, thanks for coming on.
I can't believe you're a Bruckner fan, though. I'm just appalled by that.
I can't believe you would diss Bruckner, Ben.
They're arguing about music. Don't let it get to you.
So one day you'll regret it. Not like it, Bruckner. So Olivia, thanks so much for coming on. I was not aware until this show today that you had been a career employee there, and so which makes me feel even worse for you. But the question I have really concerns the atmosphere there. I'm curious about how much fear there actually was of the president, where you were and people around you. What kind of, was it fear of, permanent damage to, losing one's career? Was it worse than that, like fear for one's life? And then I'm also curious about how people cope with the fear, or maybe just gave in and became sycophants or whatever. So I was wondering if you could speak about that some.
Yeah, I think you cope with it by finding the good people, right? That are your colleagues there who are in a similar situation, and you cope with it by surrounding yourself by very close friends and family and mentors that get you through when you're losing your mind, right? I certainly had the people that I would get out of a meeting and I would be so upset, and I would call and say like, I just lived through this and I don't know what to do tomorrow. Like, how do I go into this again? And conversations like that, certainly. And but I will say that the culture of fear was very real, to the point where I think I've joked about this on Twitter sometimes, but it was very real where I unfollowed people because I was afraid that they were going to look at my social media, which they were doing, to see who I liked. Like, I followed, I had realized I was following Michelle Obama because I just followed the Obamas and their family because I liked what they were doing after being in the White House, right? And I realized that I needed to go and unfollow them. And I unfollowed the alternate Homeland Security account because I thought it was funny and things that sometimes they would post, but I unfollowed that as well. I unfollowed Bill Kristol because he was out there and people like that. So, and when the anonymous op-ed came out, I'll never forget that day. It turns out to be Miles, who I knew, but I had no idea. I was in a bathroom stall reading it. that is the kind of culture where, and then I walked out and I was like, did somebody see me reading that on my phone? And I am not a paranoid person, and I'm very strong, and I've deployed and I've been in war zones. And so I think hearing myself say that sometimes is just so unreal to me that that is actually coming out of my mouth and that I felt that way, right? The fact that you walk around and there's a culture of paranoia where you're constantly guarded and you're, and it's the fear of not just, losing your job or, it's the lying, because they have no problem destroying people's lives and making things up and lying about them. And so it's more like when I spoke out and I was scared, and I walked away from it and decided that I wanted to fight to make sure that like he didn't get reelected or do everything that I could at least to stop this from happening. It was more the fear, like, what were they going to say about me? And I know myself, and I know that I've done nothing wrong in that situation and know the conversations that I had walking out the door. But it was more like, what are they going to make up? Because you've seen them make things up about others, and they've destroyed people's lives, and the threats that come with it and the vitriol. And that vitriol and the threats are very real. And I will say that the messages, and, I did have a reporter say to me, with the first article that got published after the ad was going to air. And he did ask me, do you have security? And do you have cameras? And I said, well, we're installing some and things like that. And he said, you need to, because the day I started covering Donald Trump was the day I got security cameras for my entire house. And
Yep.
I couldn't believe I was hearing that, right? but it's so real. And the people who have been around this and have lived it will tell you that this is no joke. And when I said that there would be violence on January 6th, these circles surface and they make you a target. And there was certainly the threats that surfaced again. And there's a pattern here, though, with some of these people. When I've seen some of the more Trump loyalists that are kind of spokespeople for them, if they tweet at me or they include me in it, overnight the heat turns up and I get the vitriol, we get the death threats coming in. It's like clockwork. And I think people are aware of that, right? And you see how they treat people. And so when you're in the White House, you're watching this and you're in this environment, and it is fear of retaliation. It's fear of what they're going to do to your personnel record or your clearance. What are they going to lie about? Like, you don't have control over that. And there's people that are in charge of these agencies at the time where you don't necessarily trust them to have your best interests at heart. And I saw
and a tipping point at where that forces
people
you to stay in versus go out.
Go through this.
Yeah, sorry.
Just
I didn't mean
in case anybody thinks Olivia is exaggerating, I've covered a lot of sensitive issues. I've dealt with I've never had security issues until the Trump administration. For obvious reasons, I don't talk about it publicly, but she's not exaggerating. It's just that simple.
Do you feel like it was the threat, like that fear, like was something that kept you closer to the administration, or would like made you more like you had to get out now before like it got even worse?
I think it's no, because I guess it's a little different for me because I was a career professional. So I knew that there was a circle out there, a network,
right,
that knew me for me, right? And so I would have this sort of net. The issue for me was that remaining within the circle, kind of in the sphere, I would say, I felt like they were still going to kind of control my career back at DHS to a certain extent. And so you kind of have to continue to stay sort of in line. Does that make sense? Like, you've got to be really careful what your next steps are. And like they really wanted me to take political appointments. And, when you say no, you got to figure out how you say no so that they don't question why you wouldn't take one, because, right. So that's also another question. So you have to figure out how you respond to those things.
I'd never thought about that. That's
if you say no, then you're a non-loyalist. And that was very real. They were looking thoroughly. There's some reporting that talks about the head of presidential personnel having people take loyalty tests, and I never had to take one because I was a career, but I was certainly aware that you were being watched. And it is hard. And so I decided that because of that, I just needed to break away. And then at some point though, I made the decision that I was going to come forward, and because I just couldn't, I don't think that I would have been able to live with myself continuing to watch the rallies and what was happening during the pandemic and not come forward and say, this is what's happening. This is what's been happening behind the scenes. And you don't know whether people are going to believe you, whether, yes, they're going to call me a traitor. But if I reached just one voter or one person or saved one life by saying you should really stop listening to, you should wear a mask or something like that, that at the end of the day, that's what really mattered to me.
If you think about the 2020 election as a coalition of increased minority voter turnout and swing voters in suburban districts, I'm certain the effects were real. I mean,
Really real.
I don't know how Biden wins without a whole lot of Republican, mostly female voters in swing areas of Pennsylvania, in suburban areas of Pennsylvania, in Georgia, and and that's what, those are the people that Sarah and that project were targeting. Janine, the floor is yours.
Olivia, this has been fantastic, and thank you so much for sharing your experiences and insight with us. And I know you're mostly here to talk about your time under the Trump administration, but I am really curious about your time in the Bush administration. Because after 9/11, of course, the national security scene people started paying more attention to it, and that's when national security law started becoming its own kind of topic in law schools. So I would love to hear what that you can discuss is the most interesting thing you worked on in the national security sphere in the Bush administration.
Well, I certainly was there for Iraq, and I was there for the reconstruction of Iraq. I was in the Pentagon in 2003 and deployed, but I was a very junior officer. So I was actually Ambassador Paul Bremer's aide. I was his assistant, and so I sat right outside his door in the palace. And I think watching that firsthand, I think I learned a lot about nation building very firsthand as a junior officer. Again, I was, I'm not going to paint myself as like a major policy guru or whatever, because I was literally fresh out of college. I was like his scheduler and his aide and things like that. But I certainly sat in the meetings of governance and saw, what was happening with the Iraqi army at the time, what was happening dynamic wise across the Middle East. And, I grew to really love the Middle East as a region, living it firsthand, and grew to really love the Iraqi people and getting to know them, and learned how hard it is to really do nation building. And in areas where, where you come in and you think that you're going to promote democracy, but it's really not that simple in other countries. And I think that was one of the more eye-opening experiences for me very early on, and watching kind of how that develops, and watching detention operations, I would say too, in the Pentagon, and how that develops and what that leads to in terms of detainees and enemy combatants, as the term is referred to, and Guantanamo operations. I think all of that in the aftermath of terrorism in Iraq were really big learning experiences for me. And I will say I was very fortunate in some ways to work for some very senior people at the time. So I really saw policy making at a very senior level very early on in my career.
Ben is muted, but saying something very intricate in the sunlight.
I said, Tony, the floor is yours, and ignore the Greek chorus.
Okay, great. Oh, okay. I will then. I'll ignore them.
Are you like, what are you doing?
Sorry, Olivia.
The Greek chorus
They were
is
joking
making
about
fun of Tony's chest hair, and that is
Tony.
inappropriate.
My chest
Inappropriate. We don't make
Yes,
fun of people's
totally
appearances on In Lieu of
inappropriate.
Fun, except if it's Ben.
I apologize, Olivia. Yeah. I'll have you know, Ben, that I am actually burning calories while I'm watching In Lieu of Fun. So
I can tell
just
you're
thought I'd
like
let you know.
pumping away your under the desk
I
elliptical
support that.
machine.
I support that.
I know you do. I know you do. Although Shane
I'm
does
impressed.
not, obviously.
You should be impressed. Both Ben can host an entire episode of In Lieu of Fun while like burning 1,000 calories and under the desk elliptical. And it's just like, it's like a duck. It's like a duck on the water. Like it's just like paddling furiously and completely placid on top.
Yes. And he doesn't look clammy like I do. And his chest tuft doesn't come out of the top of his t-shirt.
Your question, sir.
Olivia, I think you already answered my question. I was going to ask why it was that more people didn't come out like you did. And I think you've answered that. But your answer kind of made me think, and I don't know if you can answer this or not, but maybe you can. But what about the press? I mean, they knew this guy was a mobster and a threat and a thug, and his followers were. And sure, we know that because they reported some of it. But on the other hand, they would just have these people on their Sunday shows and act like it was normal. And I was just wondering if maybe you could comment on why that might have been. And maybe if things might have been different had they been calling them on this consistently.
Well, I think that's a really interesting question. And I think that's a challenging thing to really kind of grapple with, I would say, because I think that if you don't have these people and give them a platform, then I think that you get the charge of the fake news business and how it's only one-sided. And the White House really, I think, what I will say was, I think the Trump administration really mastered the art of misinformation and mastered the art of doubling down on the fake news narrative to undermine the media consistently from day one, right? And so I think that, and you see that play out in the pandemic firsthand. And I think one thing that I found super striking about this White House was between the infighting going on internally, the amount of hits that they would put out on each other was impressive. And the way they would plant stories and corroborate them, I think made it very hard. I can't even imagine being a member of the press for a journalist dealing with that situation and trying to figure out what's really true and what isn't, and what story has been placed. And I won't get too far into this, but I'll say that Azar's team was immaculate at doing that on others to an impressive level.
Yeah, he is skated by with much less scrutiny than I think probably was justified. David Botts, you have outdone yourself today with a fake dog shirt.
This is even better than April Fool's. That's my dog in the bottom.
The
bottom left.
tiger. It's a great.
I love
good,
that
David.
look for you. I'm a little sad. I'm a little sad we can't see your full beard over the dog shirt, but you know, we can only ask so much.
You get the last question today.
Well, thank you. Olivia, it's been really, really special having you on, and I appreciate what you've done, and I appreciate your service to the country. And it really helped me reframe and like understand your story, because I saw you come out, but I didn't have any sense of this whole backstory. So I hope there's a fabulous book in the works. But I am interested in your thoughts. To what degree has staffing or bringing people into national intelligence and or investigation into the emerging domestic terrorism, counterterrorism been stifled by the former?
Yeah, that issue, I will say, was probably the hardest to grapple with under this administration, because there was really no room to discuss the topic. And I I had taken the job at the Department of Homeland Security originally because I really wanted to focus on homeland issues. I had worked a lot of my tenure prior to my spot at the Department of Energy that looked at more like the electrical grid and critical infrastructure. I've mostly been focused on global terrorism in terms of overseas and looking at Middle East operations and looking at that era. And so I really had a passion more for, I had written my thesis on transnational organized crime. I have been very passionate about looking at the cartel problem in Mexico and other Latin American countries, because that has impacted my own family in Mexico. And, I've had people killed just standing in the street by the cartels that were just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. And so that really shifted my focus to what was going on here in terms of these networks and gangs in the homeland. And I wanted to work on more like domestic issues and domestic terrorism. And the rise of kind of the threats more on the homeland aspect of it and homegrown threats. And I think, unfortunately, I definitely saw this at DHS, excuse me, that the narrative was so focused on just immigration and the wall so far over the top that there was no even bandwidth or leeway to really tackle anything else. And when I got into the White House, watching the mass shootings especially was draining for me and very hard, because a lot of these were tied to either domestic terrorism or hate crimes and some of the things that we were seeing in terms of trends, and knowing that they were not going to address it, and that they were not going to put out the statements and condemn things and condemn certain groups in a manner that needed to happen before this started to gain traction. And but I will say this, the national security apparatus has not really focused on domestic terrorism, regardless of what administration has really been in office, right? This is an emerging threat, but I don't think that we have been really positioned, especially at the National Security Council. There hasn't been an office of domestic terrorism until now. I know that they're really focused on it now, and I'm grateful that they have pulled that out from the Counterterrorism Directorate, because that needed to happen. Because what would happen is we'd have these conversations about the domestic terrorism threat, but it was always under the Counterterrorism Directorate, which really just focused on global threats. And it was very hard to get focus on domestic incidents that needed to happen when this would take place. But on the other hand, this was an administration that was not going to put out statements condemning like far-right extremists or things like that, because the narrative of Antifa and law and order was very critical to them. And I did see that firsthand. And I'm not trying to over politicize it, but I did live that, and I saw what happened when these things like the MAGA guy driving around in the van that had all the Trump paraphernalia and was sending out the packages to people. I tracked that case. I worked on that response to that case, and it was very hard to figure out internally. I would brief the facts knowing that this was not going to be something that they were going to kind of crack down on. Does that make sense? So there was no real resources placed to it.
We're going to leave it there. Olivia Troy, you're a great American. We should have you back to talk about some of the substantive areas that you have real expertise on, rather than just the horror show that you lived through.
And we don't always look like this. It is a Sunday, so we just...
only most days. I almost always wear a dog shirt.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
I feel like we need a dog shirt next time. I can't believe my dog failed
I'll
me.
send you
to
one.
get him. Brendan said.
I know.
I will get you a dog shirt.
You can come back on the show. This was so lovely. Like, seriously, I'm sorry that everything you've gone through, it sounds like it's just, but thank you for sharing your story. Seriously, I think that it put a lot of color on like a hard issue for a lot of people. And I know that it takes a lot to tell that story. So thank you for coming on.
We will be back tomorrow with Clint Watts to talk about all kinds of stuff, including his very moving article about his daughter, COVID, and special needs children. We may be at a special time tomorrow because Kate is mobile tomorrow and is heading up to Cape Cod. So we may start a little late. So watch the announcement tomorrow for showtime, which may be at 6, or maybe it's 7, or maybe normal time, depending on,
what we decide
traffic.
in the next
Yeah.
24 hours. I know.
Anyway, so that'll start some number of hours and 42 minutes from now. And until then, Kate?
We don't have fun anymore, but we can definitely find out how to get Olivia her own dog shirt.
It's true. There is no shortage of dog shirts.